weird dreams and, mercy and that gruesome banquet all kind of backfired and led to Cyrus' rebellion and eventually takeover of the Medean Empire. What's up, everybody? This is the Problem Academy, and welcome back to class. We're going to go into a little bit of history today from the ancient Near East, one of my favorite stories from there because it's just very twisted and dark. But I just want everybody to kind of picture a king that gets so freaked out by this nightmare that he has that he orders one of his generals to kill his own grandson. And that general that he trusts actually doesn't go through with it. So the kid winds up surviving. And then, you kind of fast forward a decade, the same general gets invited to a big feast that the king throws for him. And, everybody's eating, drinking, having food is amazing. And suddenly, after all the meal's done, the king drops a bomb on that general. And the meal that he ate was his own son that they cooked up just for him. I mean, it definitely sounds like a horror thriller movie and stuff that, would come out in some B theaters, some independent movie. But this comes from Herodotus, who's looked at as like the first historian. It's basically like that's his story of how the Medean Empire fell and how the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great took their place. So today's episode, we're kind of going to go back to about 550 BC, and we're going to talk about the nightmare that Cyrus's grandfather had and how the weird dreams and mercy and that gruesome banquet all kind of backfired and led to Cyrus' rebellion and eventually takeover of the Medean Empire. So we're going to kind of go through Herodotus' whole story, get some quotes, and, then maybe take a look at more contemporary and like the Babylonian records to kind of balance it out. And honestly, like I said, with ancient history, it's kind of like legend and real events all kind of intertwined into one, but you have to believe it because there's nothing else. So let's kind of jump into the initial dream. So the king of Medea, his name was Astyages, and he has a daughter named Medea. And one night, he goes to sleep and he has this nightmare. I'll just kind of read off what Herodotus says. That he dreamed, quote, dreamed that she urinated so much that the urine filled his city, then went on to flood all of Asia, end quote. So, and like I said, it's a weird story, but, the king woke up and he went to his magi and advisors and all that. And the dream interpreters, they told him that means that Mundane's future son is going to rule all of Asia and knock him off the throne, drown him and take over. So at this point, she was, young, single. So he was afraid of that. So he decided that he's going to marry her to one of his vassals, whose name was Cambyses the First. Now, Cambyses was the king of Anshan, and which is like in southern Iran today, and that's where kind of in the area of Persia. So, he says like no son of a Persian will ever rule the Medean Empire. So, all right, we got rid of that problem. But eventually, they get married. Mundane does get pregnant. And then after that, Astyages has another nightmare. And we'll go back to Herodotus for this. And he says, quote, it seemed to him that from the womb of his daughter a vine grew, and this vine overspread the whole of Asia, end quote. And again, he went back to the magi and his advisors and the dream analyzers, and they gave him the same bad news, that the kid that's growing inside of her is going to go on to take his place as king and rule over all of Asia. Now, just for quick reference, at the time, Asia was mostly like the Middle East today. That's kind of what they called Asia. They didn't really know, this is coming from a Greek Herodotus. So he didn't really know much past east of Iran and all that. Well, anyway, so Astyages calls, his top general, a man named Harpagus, and just gives him the order that take this newborn baby and kill him. Get rid of him because I don't want him to kill me and take over my throne, and just dispose of the body so nothing's left. So Harpagus then winds up taking him, into the countryside, and can't bring himself to kill the baby, which, that's a good thing. Don't murder babies. But he runs into a shepherd whose wife just had given birth to a stillborn. So, he said, all right, you know what? That's kind of gets me out of it. So he gives them the newborn baby and takes the stillborn, and, that's proof basically that he killed the baby. Well, after a few years, the boy, Cyrus, he grows up in the mountains thinking, he's just a regular kid, shepherd's son. He's a tough guy, a tough kid. And his natural leadership qualities come out because, that's what they thought back then is, that kingship gets passed on to your son because royalty is in your blood. You're just a natural leader because of your blood. And then Herodotus has a story about it too. And, the village boys play a game and they pick the young Cyrus to be their king. And, he bosses them around and assigns them jobs like spearman and messenger. And one noble son who was playing with them kind of refused, who is this shepherd's son to tell me what to do? And then Cyrus has him punished. And it kind of gives the hint of, of who he really is and his lineage. And that's what then he gets noticed by the noble, who then brings him before the king, Astyages. And, he notices, oh, this boy looks like me. And I guess, puts two and two together. This is my grandson, and he was never killed. So, needless to say, he was very upset with his general. But he doesn't really say anything at first. And then when he kind of confronts Harpagus with it, he pretends, you know what, I've regretted that decision for my whole life. And, I'm so happy that he's alive. And, let's have a big feast to celebrate. And, you send your son over now so my grandson has somebody to play with. And, then we're going to throw this big feast in honor of you, saving my grandson's life. So Harpagus is definitely relieved. He thought he was going to get probably executed or something for not following through with the order. So he sends his son off. And then later on that day, Harpagus shows up thinking he's excited and thinking he's off the hook, all that. So the feast begins, and, the mead starts flowing, and the wine and food is served. They're having stew and lamb and mutton, and everybody's eating, having a good time. King is up on his platform, kind of just, observing and having fun with everybody. So then once everything is kind of all wrapped up, and everybody had eaten their fill, Astyages drops the news onto Harpagus. And, again, Herodotus is just a showman. So let me just say his quote, because he lays it out the best. Quote, "Before Harpagus was placed the flesh of his own son, all but the head and the hands and the feet. Then when it seemed that Harpagus was satisfied with food, Astyages asked him whether he had been pleased with the banquet. And when Harpagus said that he had been very greatly pleased, they brought to him the head of his son covered up, together with the hands and the feet. So when Harpagus obeyed and uncovered, he saw the remains of his son. And seeing them, he was not overcome with amazement, but contained himself. End quote. I kind of love the drama of the buildup of they eat and then they bring him a platter and did you enjoy it? Yeah, I did. And hey, why don't you just lift up, see what we had? And there's your son's head, hands, and feet on a platter. As I said, Herodotus is just a showman. Well, then Herodotus kind of stares at him and asks Harpagus if he knows what kind of animal he just ate. And Harpagus, again, like Herodotus said, contained himself, kept his composure, and says that whatever the king wants is fine with him. And then he kind of collects what's left of his son's body, goes home and buries it, and I guess, has a funeral for him there. And, even though he kept his composure, he was definitely burning with rage and grief and all these types of emotions that you can only imagine. Like I said, this is why you gotta love ancient history. It's just, all these things, all these played up motifs and everything. These civilizations around the world have kind of all had these stories, kind of Rome with the same thing, that these newborns were just left down the river, and Moses in the Bible. These are just kind of repeating motifs and stuff that they are powerful. And, for whatever reason, that was a big thing in ancient history. It's just leaving babies to die. But that banquet story is just always very powerful when you hear about it. But kind of getting back into the main story here, as time goes on, Cyrus goes back to Anshan to live with his real parents, the princess and the king of Anshan, Cambyses, and eventually does take over his father's throne to be the king of Anshan. And during this time, Harpagus still remained loyal and, performed all his duties. And eventually, when Cyrus took over, he wrote a note to him that he stuck in the stomach of a hare that they, hunted, and then sewed the animal back up, gave it to a couple people that he trusted to act as messengers to travel to Cyrus and give him the animal with the message in it. And the message said, telling Cyrus to rebel and to usurp his grandfather's throne, and that Harpagus and a lot of the nobles and the military would help, defect and then help him. So, he does just that. And around 553 BC, the rebellion starts, and Cyrus leads his army towards the Medean capital of Ecbatana. And, they get onto the battlefield, a little bit of skirmishing, and then not too much fighting happens. But Astyages is there along with Harpagus and his military, and Cyrus is there. And basically, after a little bit of fighting, Harpagus gives the signal, and the Medeans defect. They take with him, they take Astyages along with them, cross over the battlefield, and, hand him over to Cyrus. Then whatever is left of the Medean army either flees or is, destroyed on the battlefield there. There's not much left. Cyrus then winds up marching on Ecbatana, and this capital very much just falls without any resistance. That's kind of a whole theme when it comes to Cyrus. Another theme is Cyrus is known for his clemency. I mean, he pretty much pardons everybody that he goes up against. And his grandfather's no different. He doesn't execute him. He doesn't even do anything, really. He gives him a place in Cyrus's court, as one of his advisors. And, all the Medeans that had defected were already with Cyrus. And, the ones that didn't, really couldn't do anything about it, but seeing how their king was then treated at this point, they kind of just went along with Cyrus. It wasn't really more a conquest as much as like a hostile takeover of a company. So it started kind of like, the whole story starts with these weird nightmares of his daughter urinating and flooding the whole world, and then a vine growing out of her womb and encircling the whole earth. Is kind of what led to Astyages and the Medeans' downfall. From that point on, they were known as the Achaemenid Persians, not the Medeans. The Persians wound up ruling, the Near East and Asia at the time for about 200 years. And, the Medeans aren't really known. They're a very obscure empire from that period of time, but they are part of a huge event, which was the fall of the Assyrian Empire. And, if you know your Bible, your biblical history and all of that, the Assyrians were the big bad guys of that region. They were some of the most advanced, but they were brutal. I mean, the Assyrians had carvings and mountain reliefs and stuff of just all these things that they did to the conquered peoples, flaying them alive and spreading salt and thorn bush and digging up the graves of whoever they conquer's ancestors and throwing them in the rivers. So eventually Assyria pissed off enough people that the Babylonians, who were forever hostile with Assyria, the Medeans, and I think a few of some Scythians, who were like horse nomadic tribes from like the Caucasus regions, like Armenia and Georgia up there. They had all kind of come down to take down Nineveh, which was the capital city of Assyria, together. And then kind of just went and had their own separate empires, which you put up a map here. But, it's definitely one of the more twisted stories in history that from the first time I heard it, and then once I read Herodotus, it just always stuck with me. But we kind of have to take everything he says with a grain of salt. Herodotus wrote about this stuff, 100, I think he was about 400. He lived about 400 BC, so about 150 years later, which actually isn't that uncommon with ancient history. But, they also believe that Herodotus really wasn't writing for people to read as much as like it be performed in the amphitheaters and stuff around Greece. So you have all this drama, this build up, like they're all eating, and then the king comes over and, oh, well, how did you like your food? And I liked it. And, well, here, see what you had. And, like that's more for a performance than it is a historical account. So, and again, he's kind of just going off of like folklore and Persian, stories that have just passed down by word of mouth. And like we talked about earlier, the baby that's to be killed, that's a reoccurring story throughout ancient history. But the Babylonians, they do have a more contemporary writing about it, and it's the Nabonidus Chronicle, who was the king of Babylon when Cyrus had, before Cyrus conquered them, and was the king who was conquered. And, the Assyrians, Babylonians, all of them don't have any build up. They are just very blunt, very frank about it. So I'll just kind of read what that says about it. Quote, Astyages mustered his army and marched against Cyrus, king of Anshan. The army of Astyages revolted against him, and they delivered him to Cyrus. Cyrus marched all night back to the royal city. End quote. So like I said, there's no story there. It's just kind of the broad bullet points. But, then we also have he was actually a Greek doctor who was living in, worked in the Persian court at the time, about the time that Herodotus was writing as well. His name was Theseus, and his story is very different. It kind of follows the same Babylonian telling, like there was a rebellion and then there was a defection, and Harpagus was probably a real person. That name was probably passed down, but again, the banquet and the kid being killed and being found out to be his grandson just because of how he acts, that's all left out of Theseus's accounts as well. So, like I keep saying, is that you have to believe it because there's nothing else. And at least with this story, there's contemporary accounts and another, later on down the line, but from a different perspective, account of the main events happening. So as long as we have that and we know that, then at least, we can believe as much of the exciting and chilling and, dramatic story that we want. It's good to have the archaeology and, the written accounts, like the king's records and stuff like that, because then we can, we have something concrete here that we can build off of. At least we know this happens. And, again, it's what makes this period of history so interesting to me is that you have these stories and you have these things, because it's up to the imagination of the people who were around back then. And they definitely had an imagination. Oh. So afterwards, after he conquers Medea and, founds the Persian, Achaemenid Persian Empire, he has the Medeans stick around. They're actually reliefs that they carve into the capital. You could see them here. That those are alternating, Persians and Medeans. They all kind of look the same to us, and I couldn't tell you which one is which, but I know that they alternate. And at the time, it would have been very obvious to the people. So it's kind of like a show of incorporation rather than conquest. And this is where Cyrus's reputation begins and builds from. He was known for his clemency. He never really, he never didn't destroy and torture people like the Assyrians did, and even the Babylonians did. He didn't, move whole populations like you see the Assyrians and Babylonians do, and the Medes too. They, followed that same path. But Cyrus kind of has like this new way of conquering with clemency and open arms, and he doesn't want anybody to change their religion or do this or do that. It's just keep going the way you are. You're just under my leadership now. So he actually winds up conquering the largest empire at the time up to date. He goes, like I said, he conquers Lydia, which is in like modern Turkey, like Western Turkey. And, again, Herodotus has a story about how that happened, and it does follow archaeological and contemporary records, but there's, how he breaks into the capital city of Lydia is just another one of these things. And then he goes on to conquer Babylon, which spoke about in a past episode, where, supposedly they were in the middle of some religious festival and didn't even know that Babylon was being conquered. His son, Cambyses II, winds up conquering Egypt, and eventually that family is kind of overthrown. And another crazy story that we might cover, but and that's, if you've seen the movie 300 or anything like that, the man who usurps Cyrus's family, Darius, his son is Xerxes. He's the golden tall guy. I am a generous god. So that's kind of the lineage to get to that point. So I kind of just wanted to talk about this because, Iran is always in the news, and it's just one of my favorite stories from history. It kind of just folds into so many different things to where, most people most everyday people don't really even know much about like the movie 300, and they might remember learning about the Greco-Persian Wars, but behind that and before that, there's so many rich historical stories and twists and stuff that you just want to go see it. And Cyrus is looked at as one of the greatest conquerors. Up until Alexander, he's looked at as the greatest conqueror, and he's also one of the greatest like humanitarian human rights figures as well, because of his clemency. Like you said, he conquered Lydia, he conquered Babylon. Those kings also went on to be advisors, ultimately up until his death. Actually, the king of Lydia, his name was Croesus, and supposedly Herodotus' account of his death, which there isn't many contemporary stories of, but in his chronicle of it, Croesus is advising him up until then. He goes to war with these steppe nomad tribes, and this particular tribe was led by a woman, and she basically challenges him to come to her side of a river for a battle if he wants to conquer her. And Cyrus's advisors are saying, no, let them come to us, fight on our ground. And Croesus is there telling him, no, you can't give ground to a woman. You have to go after her. That would be embarrassing. So anyway, tying in with Iran, and then just actually how Trump pretty much abandoned his own base, and like we talked about yesterday's episode, is that when the Democrats are going to lose the midterm, Trump turned on some of his biggest longtime supporters, people, Tucker, Alex Jones, Megyn Kelly, a few other people as well. And he's kind of just gone to the side of, the neocons, the never Trumpers. But it's kind of a reoccurring thing where, the leader, he gets too powerful and he wants to where his say goes, and he won't stand any disloyalty or any bad polling or, anything that will come after him. So he'll start turning on the closest people. And that's what's going to eventually lead to his and everybody who does its downfall. You lash out at your closest friends and family and advisors and supporters. Well, who knows the best way to take you down? It's those people. So, power breeds paranoia, and paranoia breeds downfall. So, and what do you still get? Whether you buy Herodotus's dramatic take or lean more towards the Babylonian, dry story of it, the takeaway is solid. It's loyalty, revenge, and bad decisions have always messed with how countries and leaders rise and fall, and they'll continue to do so permanently. So I kind of, let's see what you guys think. Should Herodotus be believed? Is there some truth to what he says from, the oral traditions that are passed down that he was talking about? Or should we kind of just throw the whole thing out and just believe, what we can prove? Let me know in the comments. Kind of want to know what part of the story, which nightmare you think was weirder. And thanks a lot for coming to class today. This is the Problem Academy, and I hope you all have a great day.